The state of gaming on Linux has changed substantially over the last several years. The specific changes have accumulated to the point where the overall picture is different from what most people still remember. The specific shift has several elements. The Proton compatibility layer has matured to the point where it runs most Windows games with minimal user involvement. The specific coverage of Proton now extends to essentially all games that are sold through Steam and to a substantial fraction of games sold through other platforms. The specific performance, which I have discussed in other videos, is now competitive with Windows for most games and is in some cases better. The specific user experience from the user's perspective is that installing and running a Windows game on Linux is, for most games, as straightforward as installing and running a Linux native game would be. For users who have been holding off on Linux because of gaming concerns, the specific state of the ecosystem in 2026 is worth understanding in detail, because the concerns that were valid in previous years may no longer be valid. I want to walk you through what Proton is, what it does, what its specific coverage is, what the remaining gaps are, and what the experience of using it is like in practice. Let me start with what Proton is and how it works. Proton is a compatibility layer developed by Valve Corporation, the company behind Steam. Proton is built on top of Wine, which is an open source compatibility layer that has existed for decades, with specific additions and improvements that Valve has developed. The specific components include DXVK, which translates DirectX graphics calls, to Vulkan, VKD3D, which translates newer DirectX calls, and various other specific tools that handle specific categories of Windows APIs and behaviors. Proton is integrated into Steam, which means that Steam users can enable Proton with a specific setting and then install Windows games directly through the Steam client. When a user installs a Windows game through Steam on a Linux computer, with Proton enabled, Steam handles the installation and the specific configuration needed to run the game. The user, from their perspective, has installed a game and can launch it. The Proton details happen in the background. The specific coverage of Proton, in terms of which games work, is extensive. Valve maintains a compatibility rating system called the Steam Deck Verified program, which rates games based on how well they work. On the Steam Deck, which uses a Linux-based operating system, the ratings include verified, which means the game works without user intervention, playable, which means the game works with some minor adjustments, unsupported, which means the game does not work, and unknown, which means the game has not been tested. The specific proportions of games in each category have shifted substantially over time, with more games in the verified category each year. In current data, the specific breakdown is that approximately half of the most played Steam games are verified, approximately a quarter are playable, and approximately a quarter are unsupported or unknown. The specific games that are unsupported tend to be games with kernel-level anti-cheat systems that do not work with the translation layer. The specific games that are unknown tend to be older games or less popular games that have not been specifically tested. Beyond the Steam Deck Verified program, the broader community maintains compatibility databases, including ProtonDB, which aggregates user reports on how games work under Proton. The ProtonDB ratings include Platinum, which means the game works flawlessly, Gold, which means the game works with minor adjustments, Silver, which means the game works but with noticeable issues, Bronze, which means the game runs but with significant issues, and Borked, which means the game does not run. The specific distribution of ratings shows that the large majority of reported games are Platinum or Gold, with a smaller number in the lower categories. The specific experience of using Proton in 2026 is, for most games, straightforward. The user enables Proton in Steam's settings, installs a Windows game, and launches it. The game works. The user does not need to know that Proton is doing anything. The game appears in the library, installs through the normal Steam interface, and launches when clicked. For games that require specific configuration beyond the default Proton behavior, the configuration is typically accessible through Steam's settings for the specific game. Options include selecting a specific Proton version, setting specific launch options, and enabling specific compatibility features. The configuration is not required for most games, but is available for the cases where it is needed. For games that are not on Steam, the experience requires different tools. Lutris is a launcher that handles games from various IOM sources, including Epic Games Store, GOG, and various other platforms. Lutris includes specific installers for many popular games, which handle the configuration automatically. The user selects the game, runs the installer, and Lutris handles the rest. Heroic Games Launcher is a specific tool for Epic Games Store and GOG games on Linux. The tool provides a launcher that integrates with these platforms, downloading and managing games similarly to how the official platforms do on Windows. The specific experience is generally good, with most games running through Heroic without significant issues. Bottles is a tool for managing Wine environments more generally, including for running Windows applications that are not games but that users want to run on Linux. Bottles can also run games, and for some specific cases, it provides better results than Steam or Lutris. Across these tools, the specific coverage of games is extensive. For a typical gamer who plays a variety of games, the fraction of their library that will run on Linux is substantial and often complete. The specific gaps, where they exist, are usually in specific categories of games like competitive online shooters with kernel-level anti-cheat, or games that use specific Windows features that do not translate. Let me describe the specific categories of games that have issues on Linux and why. The first category is games with kernel-level anti-cheat systems. Some anti-cheat systems operate at the kernel level on Windows, which means they require deep integration with the operating system that is not available through a compatibility layer. Games that use these systems, including some popular competitive shooters, do not work on Linux. The specific list of affected games includes some of the most popular online games, which represents a real gap. The developers of these anti-cheat systems have, in some cases, added Linux support. The specific anti-cheat system called BattlEye supports Linux for games whose developers have opted in. The anti-cheat system called Easy Anti-Cheat supports Linux for games whose developers have opted in. For games using these systems where the developers have opted in, the games work on Linux. For games where the developers have not opted in, the games do not work. The specific list of games that have enabled Linux support through these anti-cheat systems has grown substantially, and many popular competitive games now work on Linux. But some specific games, including some very popular ones, have chosen not to enable Linux support, and those games remain unavailable on Linux. The second category of games with issues is games that use specific DirectX 12 features that the Vulkan translation does not fully support. The specific DirectX 12 features in question have been steadily added to the Vulkan translation, but some specific features still have imperfect support. The specific games affected are typically recent DOA titles that use the most advanced graphics features. The third category is games that have specific copy protection or DRM systems that do not work with the compatibility layer. The specific number of games in this category is small because most DRM systems either work with Proton or have been bypassed by the specific Proton compatibility work. The fourth category is games that have specific launcher or client requirements that do not translate well. Some games require specific launchers that have limited Linux support. The specific workarounds exist but may require more user involvement than most users want. Across these categories, the cumulative coverage gap is real but limited. For a user whose gaming primarily involves single-player games, most multiplayer games, and the broad category of games available on Steam, the Linux coverage is essentially complete. For a user whose gaming focuses specifically on the competitive online shooters with restrictive anti-cheat, the Linux coverage has gaps that matter. For users deciding whether to switch to Linux for gaming, the specific analysis is to check the specific games they play on ProtonDB or the Steam Deck verified database. The specific compatibility of the specific games determines whether Linux is viable. For most gamers, the answer is that Linux is viable, with the specific exceptions being the specific games that are known to have issues. The broader observation is that the gaming situation on Linux has transformed. The specific transformation has been driven primarily by Valve's investment in Proton and the Steam Deck, which has created commercial incentive for the broader ecosystem to support Linux gaming. The specific consequence is that Linux is now a serious platform for gaming, and users who have been hesitant about Linux because of gaming concerns can reconsider based on the current state. Subscribe for the next video, which covers specific game compatibility reports for the most popular games of 2026, with the specific Proton versions and configurations that work best for each. And in the comments, tell me which specific games you have tried on Linux and what the experience was. The aggregate reports from many users are what build the compatibility picture, and the specific reports from your experience contribute to that picture.